I am on the programs committee, so I have the honor of introducing our speaker today. We are going to hear a presentation from Leslie Davenport. Leslie is a marriage and family therapist who brings innovative climate solutions to the halls of academia, clinical settings, and to the streets. She is the author of 3 books, including Emotional Resiliency in the Era of Climate Change. Leslie is a founding member of the Institute for Health and Healing at California Pacific Medical Center, and her 25 years of developing an integrative, collaborative healing model has informed her approach to climate justice. Her former profession as a dancer keeps creativity alive in all that she does. She has served on Red Cross disaster mental health teams and the 350.org Marin Clean Energy Campaign. This year, she is teaching climate psychology on faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies, JFK University, a webinar with Cosmos Journal, Hollyhock Retreat Center, and at Spiru Haret University in Romania. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Davenport, MFT.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you for being here. I know it's a gorgeous day outside, and that's always competes with being indoor listening to a talk. So I hope that means that this topic in particular is of interest to you. It's sometimes a hard one to want to hear about, climate change. In fact, someone mentioned that to me ahead of the talk, of calling me brave for taking on this topic. But it's one we're going to be hearing more and more about. And of course, in this area, I'm sure you're very familiar, given the fires that have occurred and how there has been some conversation about the link to climate change and why things happen the way they did. And our field, psychology, mental health, has so much to offer to this conversation. Not only the more traditional role that's established, which is mental health disaster relief work, we need that too, but what I'm going to talk about today is the way that we can use the tools and perspectives we know that we're grounded in and trained in to actually participate in mitigating, in slowing, in halting, in reversing the trajectory of climate change. You know, it's more commonly acknowledged now that climate change is a result of human behavior. You hear that. And so what's kind of the art and science of the study of human behavior other than what we do? And yet we're rarely at the table with the engineers, with the scientists, with the policymakers, when we have so much to offer when it comes to understanding denial. What are the emotional underpinnings of that? How motivation works, how to facilitate conversations with contentious polarities as part of a conversation, how to work with grief and what's now being called eco-anxiety. There's even a term that's especially applicable in the climate scientist world called pre-traumatic stress syndrome, because of the projections that they look at a lot of what might unfurl. And we know when I name it this way, it seems kind of obvious of the role we have to play. So one of the things I'm here to do is to kind of connect those dots a little bit more of what's built into our field and how they overlay so perfectly with the challenges of climate change and how we can be a part of that in a more active way. Education, politics, practice of medicine, you name it, and including the practice of psychotherapy and mental health needs kind of a re-examination of the ground that we're operating from when it comes to sustainability and perspectives. And so this is a chance to maybe open that up and take a little bit more of a look at our field. So today, in just this short hour and a half, I'm going to kind of move through a lot of material. I want to just give a very quick summary of what climate science is saying is happening, but then dive more into the clinical perspective and how we can engage with this. But I'm going to start with the poetic frame. This is a short quote from Terry Tempest Williams. Some of you may know her work. And I think the first sentence, there's a few I'm going to read, but the first sentence is so powerful. The eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. They are kneeling with hands clasped that we might act with restraint, that we might leave room for the life that is destined to come. To protect what is wild is to protect what is gentle, and perhaps the wilderness we fear is the pause between our own heartbeats, the silent space that says we live only by grace. Wilderness lives by this same grace, and wild mercy is in our hands. And this is an important part. Wild mercy is in our hands because things are shifting in a way that what used to be left to kind of a genetic evolution is now changing to a cultural determination. That we are being required to be active participants because we already are, the way we've affected what's happening in nature. And so it's this really interesting pivotal place in human history. It's kind of daunting, but I really appreciate, some of you may know the work of Joanna Macy, who says it's an exciting time to be alive because it's at such a transformational point. So basically, we know that the earth is sort of sick. The earth has a fever. But in our systems thinking, the earth is kind of the identified patient, right? Because how did it get that way? What is that larger system that contributed that we're now kind of looking at the earth? Yeah, good reminder. Just a quick chance to check your cell phones. It's okay. I actually meant to mention that earlier. And when you hear about temperatures rising, the summer's going to be hotter and things like that, it doesn't seem like that would make that much of a difference. Oh, it's normally 75 to 80. I can live in 83 degree temperature, but it doesn't work like that. It makes more sense to think of it as like a body that has a fever. And to go from 98.6 to 101, just a few degrees, has a huge impact on all the systems in the body. And that's what's happening with climate change, is that, and we'll get into the details of this, but it's changing the air quality as the oceans warm up, it's changing the acidity levels. I mean, it goes on and on the way there's this very interconnected network, that's, how it works, and that all systems are being affected. I don't know what that was, but we'll keep going. So I'm going to read this quote by Brian Swim. Some of you may know him. He's a cosmologist. Again, talking about that cultural determination. We're living on the planet at a time when the evolutionary dynamics are changing. And the simple way of saying it is they're changing from genetic determination to cultural determination. And it's an amazing new power on the planet. And we have to confront the fact that this planet is evolving now according to our decisions, which we'll go into on an individual level, on a collective level. And our responsibility is to structure the human presence on the planet so that the fundamental conditions of life are strong and vibrant and can carry into the future. I think another way to kind of boil this down to a clear theme is to say that our enjoyment of individual freedoms can no longer be severed from their impact on the web of life. That we really have gone from an understanding about this way that everything is interconnected to operating very independently in silos. And that's true in communities, it's true in the decisions and the lifestyles we make. We don't know where our food comes from or where the waste goes, because it just comes from somewhere and it goes somewhere. But we're starting to see that the load on those somewheres is coming back to affect us. So this time in history has actually been named by some people who are looking at this larger scale. It's been called the Great Turning by Joanna Macy that I mentioned. She's a general systems theorist and Buddhist scholar, along with David Korten, who worked at the Harvard Business School. So kind of interesting, that much of a spectrum. Thomas Berry, a Catholic priest and cultural historian, calls it the Great Work. And so that it's being talked about as kind of a requiem of the way things have been, the way we've come to know life, but also the potential for a rebirth, for being part of that birthing into this necessary transformation. So when we do hear about climate psychology or just climate change in the news, we hear, of course, about the physical and economic impacts, the disasters that happen. But again, there's not a lot of talk about the psychological consequences. We're probably a little more aware of that because of our field, but you don't read about that so much. And again, this talk is not only about responding after an event occurs, but what can we do to be part of this transformation to really change the trajectory we're on? I really like this quote by Lise Van Susteren. She's in Washington, D.C., psychiatrist, and she goes as far as to say that climate change is a form of child abuse. She says, mental health professionals vigorously endorse requirements to report cases of child abuse. It is a legal obligation and a moral one. Is it any less compelling a moral obligation in the name of children now and in the future to report that we are on track to hand over a planet that may be destroyed for generations to come? So this kind of puts it in our court. It's not out there for somebody else at some other time, but it's something that we can look at professionally and in our field. So let me talk a little bit about this interconnection about how things work with climate change. So, you know, in the West, we've built a lifestyle that relies heavily on fossil fuels. And we think primarily about transportation, you know, cars, most of us own cars, flying. But as I was mentioning, there's all kinds of ways that pretty much everything we interact with has a carbon footprint and a carbon cost. Where do our clothes come from? Where is our food shipped across the country? You know, I love a lot of the products at Trader Joe's, and I've started paying a little more attention to like some of the frozen pizzas actually come from Italy. So the cost of keeping them cold while they fly across the country and come into the stores. You know, there's just a tremendous amount of things that, for complex reasons, have a very, very high carbon footprint. The fact that we're sort of oriented to being a disposable, single-use consumer type economy generates a huge amount, not only of the waste, but in creating all these things over and over. The cost is much higher than we end up paying for. So as a result, all this carbon gets caught in the atmosphere, and it creates sort of like a blanket, and it keeps the heat in. And it also keeps moisture in, which is why they're saying there's an increase in the intensity and frequency of storms, because it's the heat and the moisture combined that create, for example, the stronger hurricanes and things that we're seeing. I'm sure you've been hearing about things like the melting sea ice. Again, just one thing affecting another. Drought conditions are no news to those of us who live in California. But what happens, and we haven't seen too much of this yet, but you know, some of you may know that agriculture in California, one of the places that creates food for much of the U.S., has been affected by the drought. And that some of the fields in Central California that have produced agriculture for years have had to let their fields lay fallow, lay off people from the work because there just wasn't enough water. And perhaps at the end, if there's time for conversation, we could go a little bit more into but aren't there other factors involved? And there are, but there's also a kind of an undeniable trajectory with this stuff. So where's the good quality water going to come from? The food, the quality of the food. It's affecting pests, so that the having to address changes in keeping the food healthy and soil degradation, again, is going to touch all of us, even nutritionally. We'll see the way the increased pollution that affects the water and the air, and what are called vector-borne illnesses, increase in mosquitoes and stuff. We've heard about Zika. It's one example of many. So this is just a very quick graph that just shows, this is from NASA, that the rise in carbon CO2 emissions is very clearly correlated with a rise in temperatures. So again, even though we see these fluctuations, there's a pretty strong angle there of where things are going. Just quick facts. So any of you who track this know that globally, every year it starts to be, we've broken new records. This is the hottest year on record. Part of the problem is that keeps happening each year. So that out of the last 16 years, 14 of them have been named, this is the hottest year on record. That's one way to look at the climb. Glaciers are retreating. The Arctic Ocean is expected to become essentially ice-free in summer before mid-century. We've had our first, in Louisiana, a displacement of a whole community because of sea level rise, where they have been there for generations, but the land is getting too salty to support their fruit trees and the food that they're growing, and bringing mold into the homes. So our government actually paid to relocate a whole community in Louisiana. Warming oceans and acidification. The acidity of ocean water has increased about 33%. And again, we may hear or be touched by little pieces of that, like you probably know that in, I think, 2015 or 16, the crab season didn't happen around here because of the high toxicity levels. And of course, it's all based on food chains. So any area that gets hit hard is going to start rolling out to all the different marine life. And I'm sure you're aware of the plastics too that are a big problem, and a lot of that is single-use items. I mean, it's hard to wrap our head around. How can it be that if we use bottled water that it ends up in the ocean, or a plastic bag? But there are islands, huge, mile-wide islands of plastic debris floating in the oceans. There's pictures of penguins and things sitting on them. It's just remarkable what has happened. And again, extreme weather events, they're even questioning hurricanes, as I'm sure you know, get classified in 1 through 5, depending on the intensity of the speed and so forth. And now they're talking about, should they add a level 6? because things are intensifying to the point that it's kind of outgrowing the known way of classifying hurricanes. Now, this is put out for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and you will see that mental health impacts are mentioned in a couple places, up there by severe weather. Oh, I guess I have a little pointer. Up here, it says mental health. It also says it down here. My point of view is we could be in each of these. I mean, we're talking about health issues and respiratory problems and the impact of food and water and what happens with extreme heat. There's, mental health in terms of helping people cope and deal with all of this really belongs in each of those areas. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's not really the focus of my talk, but I did want to add a little bit of a bright spot, which is that I know as we go along, it's like, there are a lot of good works happening too, and that the growth of things like wind power, solar power are also on the rise. Moving to, there's more and more farmers market and local purchasing and more awareness around where our clothing comes from. But it's just not at this point yet, not growing at the same pace to keep up with the problems that are being created. But I don't want to ignore that that is actually happening too. A lot of really good work out there. So one of the things I want to emphasize is that in doing this work as therapists and just as individuals living in this world, one of the things we all need to do is increase our resiliency. Because even if we can turn this thing around, things are going to be rough for a while and they're going to get worse before they hopefully get better. So built into this is also the importance of what we might bring to our clients, what we can bring to ourselves, in increasing our capacity to be present to the intensity of difficulty. A couple of you in the introductions mentioned like Buddhist perspectives, mindfulness, and some of those tools are certainly ways to do that. And there are many. So I want us to just do a little one together now. And I'm going to ask you just to stand. You can stay where you are by your seat. But when dogs get wet, the way they dry off is sort of they start at the tip of their nose and then shake all the way down to their tail. So just find a way, gently in a way that works for your body, to do a little bit of that. So just a little bit of shaking. You can start at your head and in your shoulders, and as if you were shaking water off your hands and down through your hips and off through your feet, and do it a few times until it just starts to be like one shimmer, head to toe, just kind of shaking it off a little bit. Those of you who study some of those trauma works know that shaking is functional. So this is just kind of shaking light, but it's a good thing to do, and it's also a little playful and fun. So a couple more times, then we'll sit again. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. Okay, so I said resiliency, but what does that really mean? And I want to pose it sort of as a question, an inquiry, a koan. What in us cannot be destroyed by the shadow side of human behavior or a superstorm? What is that? What is that? And I'm going to ask you to turn to someone near you, just pair off for a minute, and just talk about that question. What comes up for you? Again, we'll take just 3 minutes. What in us cannot be destroyed by the shadow side of human behavior or a superstorm? Okay, just because it would be good to hear the range of themes that came up, or if there are very similar themes. Are a couple of you just willing to quickly verbalize what came up in your conversation? Yes.
Back here, we scared myself. Back here, we thought that it's our soul that cannot be destroyed in a superstorm. And we're just wondering the combination of shadow side of human behavior in a superstorm, what the connection is there. But that's what we came up with. And then maybe the resiliency, too, meaning that, we could get back on track after some traumatic event.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank
Come into
you.
play.
Thank you. Here's oh.
Hi. Our little table. Hope and faith is always there, that can't be destroyed. But it can become very overwhelming, and we forget to go to the well to draw on the faith and hope. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yep.
Gail and I were chatting about presence and just really kind of being in the moment and the power that holds. And for me, very much from a heart space and heart connection. And then we were chatting about how the animals live in that world. That world of presence and slow. Everything moves at a slower rhythm, a slower pace. And there's healing in that too. And being able to connect with them and their hearts that they bring creates healing and resiliency.
Thank you. Yeah.
Likewise, we all recognize the spiritual dimension, and it strikes me that if there's an upside to climate change, it's the recognition of this necessity to see that we are all connected, and that I think it's encouraging that you can turn on YouTube and hear this German Benedictine monk talking in the most practical terms how we all can access, just by our own awareness, that consciousness that connects us all. That's encouraging.
Yes, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. Yes. I completely agree. The notion of interconnectedness, especially on a spiritual plane, energetic plane, is something that lives in the heart of many contemplative traditions. We are familiar with it. There's the myth of Indra's net and that kind of thing. But you're right, this is making it very, very visible. It's making it obvious. And that is a really powerful feature of this. So kind of along these lines, the time to go in and ask those questions again. What is resiliency and where do we go from here? And this is really big and can feel overwhelming. So where can we find that source of deep guidance, not only to just recycle more or carpool more, but really get down to those places where there gets to be a very day-to-day, in the moment, visceral understanding of what it means to be a human on this earth. Believe me, I'm all for those other efforts, and I lend my weight to those as well, some of the other forms of advocacy. But I feel like, especially in our field, this is about transformation. And it feels like we are just really still learning about what it means to be a responsible human. So I want to talk about the way the familiar stress responses show up potentially in climate change work. the fight, flight, and freeze. And I'll talk a little bit about those particular ones. Oh no, I guess I have to stay here. Okay, so in the fight response, just the idea that people kind of come out swinging, that kind of person. And when I talk about these, it really needs to be with a kind of discernment, because I'm all for those who fight in the face of injustice and really lend their weight in that way to making change. But I'm talking more about kind of the shadow side, where someone's anxiety is revved up about this, and so they spend all their day blogging or Facebook posting or whatever it is that they do, to the point where they may lose, like an addiction, they lose their perspective and their responsibility toward family or work or themselves or other things. And one of the downsides about that, even if they're wishing, hoping, wanting to make a difference, get more people on board, let everyone know, is that kind of like in-your-face stuff, doom and gloom and bad things are happening, create a numbness. People start to turn away. Oh, I've heard that before. Oh, don't give me any more of that now. And it's, it kind of goes with the idea that we can't open minds by smashing heads. But it kind of has that energy to it, like, we're gonna figure this out. And also we know from our work that any change that comes about through guilt or shame does not promote change. So it's like, oh, you're not a recycler, or you're not a this, or you're not that, just does not get people on board for engagement and participation. And sometimes it gets so extreme that even within conservation groups, there gets to be a polarization. That they get so entrenched in their own point of view that there becomes kind of this radicalization where the possibility of working collaboratively towards solutions when people are bringing different possibilities forwards creates its own impasse. So, and then the flight response is, some people say that who does want to hear about this stuff? Because it is big and it is scary. We're kind of risk averse and loss averse, and so it's kind of natural to want to turn away. And there's a word which is disavowal. Some of you may be familiar with it, which is a form of denial. Denial, the way we hear about it in politics, are people just have conspiracy theories and this really isn't happening, and fake news and et cetera. Disavowal is more that, well, no, I think there's something to it, but followed by many things. It's too big, I wouldn't make a difference anyway, or someone else can take that on, or it's just too big, it's too upsetting. So that way that we can turn away, even if we do acknowledge the truth of something, is a type of disavowal. So other ways that we distance ourselves from the emotional distress aspect with flight is something called positive illusions and unrealistic optimism, which is just, it's kind of like sugarcoating. It's like, well, it's not going to really be that bad, or it's going to happen somewhere else to some other people, and kind of heightening our own sense of being protected, even if that's not really true. It's kind of an internal psychological stance. Another way of flight, turning away, distancing, is called personal greenwashing. And some of you might be familiar with the term greenwashing. It's used in advertising so that they may package something to appear more natural or healthy than it really is for the sake of sales. But our own personal greenwashing tends to be quite a bit more innocent. It's kind of like, it's amplifying sort of token efforts. So I do this, so I've kind of done my part. I do this little piece, and it's kind of to help us feel better. But if we can deal with the bigger emotions, the deeper emotions, it'll free us up to engage in a more full way. And then the freeze is just kind of the way ambivalence can keep us in one place. And we all, I first I want to say that we all experience all of these to one degree or another. I mean, I can feel the ambivalence. I'm aware of things I want to do, and yet also want some of the benefits of my lifestyle. Right now, because of a big life transition I'm in, I'm kind of back and forth between California and Washington State, and flying much more than I want to be when I look at this kind of stuff. So it's also wanting to make the change, but we all like that great fruit year-round, even if it comes from Chile or somewhere, or to keep our temperature just in that little zone where we're comfortable, sort of regardless of the larger cost. So this is all very relatable and difficult stuff. So I'm going to just add a few more reasons why it's so hard to engage with some of these big climate change issues. And again, I think we can all relate to these. We tend to prioritize immediate concerns over long-term considerations. All of us are probably working hard just to keep our life going. Get food on the table. Maybe there's families, our work life, our friends. We already got a lot going on compared to something that might happen someday in the future. We can give quotes about statistics and plastic and 33% acidity in the ocean, but it doesn't necessarily bounce off our hearts. It isn't necessarily visceral. And a lot of the changes that are happening are either so slow and gradual, like changes in temperature or seasons coming a little earlier, or CO2 that we breathe and is coming out of tailpipes and coming out of buildings is invisible. So we're not getting those little prompts to remind us of what's happening. So we have to kind of go at it from this, I have to remember to remember, versus having a way to relate to that on kind of a day-to-day basis. Social norming, where we make decisions not only individually, but based on kind of how we fit into particular groups and communities. So if we are part of one that puts emphasis on this, it can really be a support. But otherwise, we're kind of swimming against the stream. And so it can work for us or against us in that way. And then this is kind of a, partly whose job is this anyway? There are a lot of people that don't want policies in place because they just don't want large government oversight. But then if it's left to the individual, you feel kind of powerless. Should I really take, a shorter shower? Should I really bother to carry a mug in my car? Is it going to make a dent when these corporations are spewing all these toxins? So where do you get a foothold to feel like you can make a difference? And I'll just kind of group that in with worldview. And then I honestly do feel like the emotions that all of this generate are a big, big part of why it's hard to engage. Again, there might be a helplessness, a hopelessness, it's too big, it's really scary, what's going to happen to my grandchildren. It can just feel like too much. And again, that's just such a big part where we can have a role. And then privilege, there's an effort in a lot of this work to add a climate justice perspective, so that it's not just about the trees and the water, but it's about the people that are affected. And there is a disproportionate impact on the people with fewer resources, and in some ways the people who have had less of a contribution to the problem. And so how to act in a way that first acknowledges that and then factors that into how we distribute resources. And again, it may go to our own ambivalence. I'm all about that kind of equality, but it comes harder to act on it when you're asked to give something up. So this is just a way, kind of like I did with the stress responses, of just overlaying what we know about the grief cycle and how it would relate to climate change. So we've already talked a bit about denial. You know, that can look like discrediting science, rationalizations, avoidance, that kind of stonewalling. It can go into anger by, especially again, if we're challenged to change our lifestyle, which maybe we've spent 20 years working really hard to finally get in place, to take those cruises or go on those vacations or whatever that might look like. And now I have to make changes? Like, forget that, right? So kind of a righteous indignation and justifying. And then the bargaining might look like that greenwashing. Well, I'll do a little of this, and then I've played my part, and maybe even put that positive spin. That could be a part of denial or a part of the bargaining. And then sometimes just the bigger truth may just break through. And it just is, we can't unpeel our eyes once we've seen some of the things that are being talked about by science. And it can just feel like, it's too much. And then if we go toward acceptance, that is really the place where we've had a chance, again, to work with on an emotional level. It's not just, again, motivating toward more superficial lifestyle changes, but really working with this on a deeper level so that it's possible to have self-care in the face of engaging in other ways. And we know with grief, it is a wheel because it's not linear, but that all of that can slide around. We can feel like we're accepted and involved and participating, and sometimes it still feels overwhelming. And just to know that it slides around that way. So again, as we've said, the fact that these interconnectedness is becoming so clear and so obvious, the positive part is that we can contribute, we can make a difference, so that every decision we make has an actual carbon price. We're either contributing to the problem, or we're contributing less to the problem, or we're ideally carbon neutral, and there's even a phrase carbon negative. So to just know that those things really do make a difference. Again, as psychotherapists, we know that change often does start with awareness, which end up coalescing into beliefs, values, which end up being how we act in the world. And that interface in the world, again, we're always in relationship with that. So I want to do another brief experiential, kind of just a conversation like we did before in groups of 2 or 3. And I'm going to try and keep it fairly brief, so try and listen for my suggestion to kind of switch. And the first question I'd like you to talk about, either with one other person, or if I saw some of you were in 3s, and that's just fine. Some of the things I love about being alive on this earth are, the birds are some of it, the song of the birds. But take a minute just to say some of those favorite things about being here. Could be the same people you were with before, it doesn't matter. So the second question, when I recognize the destruction and suffering that's happening on earth, I feel. So take a moment with that, same groups. Okay, one more question for this section. One new question, everyone. Third one. I am called and excited to contribute to the natural world by. So just take a moment with that before we go on.